Shaquille O'Neal was driving his SUV along the desolate roads of Texas, enjoying a rare moment of peace away from the spotlight. Suddenly, the distant roar of engines broke the silence as a group of bikers, led by the notorious Duke the Crusher Lewis, blocked the road ahead. Their eyes were filled with defiance, but they didn't realize one important thing. Shaq wasn't just a basketball legend, he had also stepped into the WWE ring, showcasing strength and skills that would surprise anyone. Before this thrilling tale unfolds, let us know where you're tuning in from. Also, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and share to stay updated on more gripping stories. Shaquille O'Neal, the larger-than-life basketball icon known for his warm smile, had decided to take a break from the limelight. After decades of public life, he recognized the need for solitude to reset his life. He chose Texas, a land filled with vast open spaces and endless roads stretching to the horizon, a place where he could truly escape into nature. The sleek black SUV glided along the narrow road, its tires crunching over the fine gravel. Shaq sat comfortably behind the wheel, his massive hands gripping it firmly, while his eyes remained fixed ahead. Outside, the vibrant hues of sunset painted the rolling hills like a golden tapestry, bathing the Texas sky in deep shades of orange and purple. Inside the car, the soft twang of country music played from the speakers, blending with the gentle hum of the engine, creating a serene yet reflective atmosphere. Shaq absorbed every breath of this landscape, the dry air, the mingled scent of dust and scorched grass, and the gentle breeze brushing against his face through the slightly open window. This was the escape he had been searching for, a moment where time seemed to stand still, free from press conferences, constant travel, and endless questions about his future plans or legacy. However, as he ventured deeper into the wilderness, that tranquility began to shift into something unsettling. Shaq glanced around and realized he hadn't seen another car or person for over an hour. The road twisted ahead, stretching infinitely, flanked by barren fields dotted with low shrubs and the occasional solitary utility pole, standing like a sentinel in the emptiness. He briefly looked at the phone on the passenger seat, no signal. The little bar in the corner of the screen was completely blank, emphasizing how remote he truly was. A flicker of unease crossed his mind. It wasn't fear, but rather discomfort for someone used to constant connectivity. But Shaq quickly reassured himself, reminding himself that this was what he wanted: no noise, no interruptions. The SUV rolled on, leaving a faint trail of yellow dust behind. As the sky ahead shifted from golden hues to deep purple with the fading daylight, Shaq felt a subtle change around him. The hills seemed to rise higher, and the scattered trees lining the road appeared like shadowy figures, silently observing him. A prickling sense of unease crept in, as if he wasn't entirely alone on this isolated road. Taking a deep breath, he filled his chest with the dry Texas air and pressed down slightly on the gas pedal. "It's nothing," he muttered to himself. "Just another drive." Yet his sharp eyes, honed from years of overcoming challenges, both on the basketball court and in the wrestling ring, reflected a glimmer of vigilance. The road ahead faded into darkness as the setting sun surrendered to the night. Shaq, ever watchful, couldn't help but notice a glint of metal in the distance. At first, he thought it was just a truck parked by the roadside, but as he got closer, he realized it was a group of motorcycles. 6 heavy bikes stood in a row, their thick tires embedded deep in the gravel. Looming figures surrounded them, some crouched, inspecting their bikes, while others leaned casually against their glossy black machines, smoking in the dim light. Shaq eased up on the gas as his sharp eyes scanned the group while his SUV rolled by. They didn't appear to be your typical weekend bikers. Worn leather jackets adorned with skull and crossbones emblems covered their backs, and their piercing, knife-like gazes told Shaq this was no harmless gang of thrill-seekers. One man, clearly the leader, caught Shaq's attention the most. He was towering and broad-shouldered, resembling a slab of granite. His scarred face showed the weight of countless fights, and his leather jacket displayed the words Crusher's Clan emblazoned on the back, not as a badge of pride, but as a warning. Duke the Crusher Lewis was a name that resonated across the wild roads of Texas. Once a Marine, Duke returned from war with a toughened body and a mind filled with violence. Instead of building a new life, he chose to dominate the highways, turning them into his personal playground for chaos. He was not just a biker. Duke was a dangerous man who wielded physical power and the ability to manipulate and instill fear in anyone who crossed his path. As Shaq's SUV rolled past, Duke's eyes locked onto him through the tinted glass. A thin smile crept across Duke's angular face, and Shaq felt a jolt, as if Duke could see right through him. It was a stare that felt more like a challenge than mere curiosity. Suddenly, the engines roared to life, and the motorcycles thundered, their rumbling breaking the stillness of the night. Shaq glanced in his rearview mirror. The bikers were on the move, their massive tires pulling away from the roadside and falling in behind his SUV. Their headlights glimmered off the asphalt like the eyes of a hunting pack. Shaq stayed composed, gripping the wheel firmly and refusing to show any signs of unease. Yet, there was something in the way they moved, an almost predatory organization, that made it clear this wasn't just a casual pursuit. They were targeting him. The precision of their formation confirmed it. One motorcycle surged ahead, pulling alongside his SUV. The rider, a bearded man with a skull tattoo on his forearm, stared directly at Shaq through the window and banged on the glass with a fist adorned with metal rings. The sharp sound echoed inside the cabin. "Nice ride, pal, but it doesn't belong on this road," he shouted, his raspy voice dripping with mockery and menace. Shaq remained calm, but inside he knew this was no random encounter. The other motorcycles quickly surrounded his SUV, herding him onto the narrow road like wolves cornering their prey. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. These weren't kids playing games, they were testing his resolve. A larger shadow loomed closer from behind as Duke arrived, roaring on a black Harley-Davidson, leading the pack like an alpha wolf. In the rearview mirror, Shaq caught Duke raising his hand in a signal, and immediately the group tightened their formation, their engines snarling as they accelerated. They were forcing his hand, daring him to act. Deep within, Shaq felt a battle-hardened instinct flare to life. No one had ever cornered him without facing consequences, but here on this desolate, shadow-filled road, he knew he had to tread carefully. These weren't mere delinquents on bikes. They were a full-fledged gang with a purpose. He didn't need further proof than Duke's cold, calculating stare and that sly, taunting grin. "So they want to test their luck with me," Shaq muttered, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He tapped the gas, and the SUV surged forward, but the bikers clung to him like shadows. Their roaring engines and screeching tires created a tense symphony that set Shaq's pulse racing. He realized that from this moment on, his peaceful journey had transformed into a battle led by Duke. The gang underestimated one crucial thing. The man they had chosen as their prey wasn't someone who backed down easily. On the dark roads of Texas, Shaquille O'Neal was ready to unleash a counter-strike they would never forget. The roar of engines grew louder, like the thunderous beats of war drums reverberating through the darkness. Shaq's SUV was completely surrounded, motorcycles closing in from all sides. Their headlights blazed into the windshield, turning the car's interior into a stifling oven of tension. Knuckles wrapped in metal tapped on the windows, and fists pounded the car body in rapid succession, a relentless challenge. A young biker, his long hair matted with sweat, pressed his face against the side window and yelled, "Get out, big guy, or are you just a giant coward?" Shaq gripped the steering wheel tightly, his cold gaze flicking to the rearview mirror. His mind worked like a calculating machine, analyzing every move of the bikers. He knew evasion wasn't an option. These men weren't just here to taunt. They wanted to push him into a corner, to trap him on this dark road with no escape. Duke the Crusher Lewis, the gang leader, pulled up alongside the SUV on his massive Harley-Davidson. Leaning into the handlebars, he stared straight at Shaq through the tinted glass. Duke's chiseled face wore a menacing expression, and the glow of his bike's headlights accentuated the network of scars crisscrossing his forehead and cheeks. "Where are you running to, big man?" Duke sneered, his voice laced with mockery and challenge. "Or are you stepping out so we can size you up properly?" Shaq understood Duke's game. This wasn't just mockery, it was a test, a calculated way to gauge his reaction. Provocation was a familiar tactic for men like Duke, a way to unnerve their targets before moving in for the final blow. But Duke had picked the wrong man. Shaq slammed on the brakes, the SUV screeching to a halt on the gravel. The roar of engines behind him abruptly ceased, and the bikers instinctively pulled back slightly. The vehicle's door opened slowly, and Shaquille O'Neal's towering figure emerged under the faint glow of the headlights, standing beside the SUV. His colossal height and powerful build made him look like an immovable mountain blocking their path. Adjusting his jacket, Shaq cast a calm yet piercing gaze over the gang, standing silently. His mere presence intensified the charged atmosphere around them. The bikers, usually full of overconfidence, hesitated as they took in the sheer size and commanding aura of the man before them. They had never encountered anyone like Shaq, someone whose physical strength was matched by an unsettling calmness that threw them off balance. Duke, still mounted on his Harley, didn't flinch. Instead, he smirked, the corners of his mouth curling into a mocking grin. Stepping off his bike, his heavy boots crunched against the gravel. Duke was tall, but even he had to crane his neck to meet Shaq's gaze. "Well, I've got to admit, you're more impressive than I thought," Duke said, stretching his words as if savoring them. "But the question isn't how big you are, it's whether you know how to use it." Shaq's gaze remained locked on Duke, silent and unyielding. His silence cut through the gang's mocking laughter like a knife. Duke raised an eyebrow, sensing that this man was unlike others he had faced. But the challenge only fueled Duke's resolve. The bigger the test, the sweeter the victory. "So here's the deal, big guy," Duke continued, resting his hand on a heavy chain slung at his side. "We play a little game. If you're brave enough to walk away from here, maybe we'll let you go. If not—" He didn't finish, but the sinister grin on his face made the threat clear. Shaq shrugged and took a deliberate step forward, the gravel crunching under his weight. "If you're looking for trouble," he said, his deep voice steady and resolute, "you've found the right man." Without another word, Duke whipped the chain from his side, the clinking metal slicing through the air like a crack of thunder. The other bikers instinctively stepped back, forming a loose circle around the two men. They knew the game had begun, but what they didn't realize was that Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just a giant. He was a fighter through and through. They had made a grave error by underestimating him. Under the flickering glow of headlights and a hum of engines, the first clash between Shaq and Duke's gang was about to erupt. The atmosphere within the circle of motorcycle headlights grew tense, almost suffocating. Duke stood there, his gaze drilling into Shaq with challenging intensity, lightly swinging the chain in his hand like a snake ready to strike. He was never one to rush. Duke always knew how to test his opponent's patience before throwing the first punch. But Shaq was different. He wasn't easily intimidated. "Rat, show him who's boss around here." Duke growled, his tone a mix of command and provocation. A wiry biker stepped out of the circle, Jimmy Rat, with his lean frame, shifty eyes, and slick grin. Jimmy was Duke's trusted man for opening acts, quick, ruthless, and never hesitant to strike when the moment called for it. Jimmy lunged at Shaq with surprising speed, crouching low to aim for his legs, a tactic that usually worked well against larger opponents. But against Shaq, it was like a child trying to topple a wall. As Jimmy closed in, Shaq sidestepped and caught the attack with one powerful arm, sending his other fist crashing into Jimmy's chest like a sledgehammer. The sharp sound of impact echoed, and Jimmy was sent flying backward, crumpling to the ground, the air forced out of his lungs like a deflated balloon. The entire circle of bikers erupted, not in cheers, but in shock and unease. No one had expected a giant like Shaq to be so quick and decisive. "Get up, Rat," Duke roared, but Jimmy only lay there, groaning and clutching his chest. Shaq raised an eyebrow, his expression calm yet filled with warning. "Who's next?" He said it, his deep voice rumbling like thunder across an open field. The words acted like a spark to dry tinder, igniting chaos. Duke didn't wait. He signaled with his hand, and the group of bikers charged all at once. The next was a burly man known as Big Mike, with a neck tattoo. He swung a baseball bat straight at Shaq's head, but Shaq moved like lightning, dodging the blow and grabbing Mike's wrist. With a swift twist, he forced the bat to clatter to the ground, then spun Mike around and hurled him into another biker who was charging in. The two collided, collapsing like dominoes. Another biker, a stocky man named Chuck, swung a length of chain at Shaq. The metallic sound whistled through the air, a deadly warning. But Shaq stepped back, evading the strike, then surged forward. He caught the chain midair and yanked it with such force that Chuck lost his balance and fell to the ground. Shaq stepped forward, planting one massive foot on the chain, his gaze daring the others to try him. Duke stood on the sidelines, his face darkening. This wasn't going according to his plan. Shaq wasn't just strong. He was experienced. Every move he made was precise, decisive, and filled with confidence. "Fall back," Duke shouted, commanding the bikers who were scrambling to their feet. The remaining members hesitated, their eyes flickering with unease as they looked to their leader. Shaq stood in the center of the circle, breathing steadily and showing no sign of fatigue. He bent down, picked up the discarded chain and swung it lightly in his hand, a silent challenge. "Who else wants to try?" His voice carried an authority that made even the boldest pause. Duke narrowed his eyes, a smirk creeping back onto his face. But this time it wasn't one of arrogance. It was the smile of someone quietly plotting. "Not bad, big god," he said, his voice slow and mocking. "But don't think we'll let you off that easy." He raised his hand, signaling the bikers to retreat. One by one, their engines roared to life, pulling back and leaving an open space between Shaq and Duke. Duke climbed onto his bike, but before revving the engine, he pointed at Shaq. "Don't think this is over. We'll see you again, and next time it'll be different." Shaq didn't respond. He simply watched as Duke and the group disappeared into the night. He knew Duke's words weren't empty threats. Instead of fear, Shaq felt a surge of determination rising in his chest. He picked up his keys, walked toward his SUV, and prepared for the road ahead. The first battle was over, but he knew the real fight was just beginning. Shaq climbed into the SUV, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, catching a faint glimpse of the dim headlights from the biker gang fading into the night. The vehicle's engine roared to life, shattering the silence. He pressed the gas pedal, leaving behind the empty gravel lot and the echoes of the skirmish that had just ended. But deep down, Shaq knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The road ahead was narrow and winding, flanked by rolling hills and scattered shrubs. The SUV's headlights pierced through the darkness, illuminating stretches of asphalt, but every yard traveled carried a nagging sense of being watched. Then, as if his instincts materialized, the rumble of motorcycle engines broke through the quiet. It started as a faint hum but quickly grew louder and more menacing, like a storm closing in. Shaq glanced at the mirror again, and this time he saw them. Bright headlights cutting through the shadows like predators stirring from slumber. The bikers were back, and they weren't here for a joyride. Duke, perched on his signature jet-black Harley-Davidson, led the pack, his cold eyes staring straight ahead, guiding the bike with effortless precision. Duke didn't need words. The way he accelerated and took point made it clear. This time, he wouldn't stop until Shaq paid the price. Shaq floored the accelerator, and the SUV growled as its tires gripped the road. The powerful engine roared, but its weight reminded Shaq that it wouldn't outrun the nimble motorcycles closing in on him. He needed a plan. The bikers rapidly closed the gap, surrounding the SUV on all sides. A young biker with a flaming skull emblem on his leather jacket pulled up alongside the passenger window and slammed his fist against the glass, shouting, "You think being a big guy means you can escape?" "Not a chance, giant." Shaq didn't respond. His focus was locked on the road ahead, his hands gripping the wheel tightly as he scanned the sharp curves. Inside, his mind worked at lightning speed, formulating a strategy. Every rev of an engine and every maneuver from the bikers became a piece of data he processed. Up ahead, the winding road curved sharply with a steep, rocky drop-off on one side. Shaq recognized the opportunity and slammed on the brakes, forcing the SUV to decelerate abruptly. The sudden slowdown caught the bikers off guard. One of them veered off course, narrowly avoiding a collision with the SUV's rear. Shaq yanked the steering wheel hard, sending the SUV screeching around the curve. The tires squealed, leaving skid marks on the asphalt. One biker wasn't so lucky. Unable to slow down in time, he careened off the road and plummeted down the rocky slope. His scream echoed briefly before fading into silence. Duke roared in frustration but didn't waver. "Keep going. Box him in," he barked, his voice carrying the authority of an unyielding command. Shaq's eyes darted to the mirror again, noting the bikers regrouping. Another rider surged forward, aiming to ram the SUV from behind. But with years of driving experience under his belt, Shaq held the wheel steady, refusing to let the impact unsettle the vehicle. The SUV barreled down a brief stretch of straight road, kicking up a cloud of dust in its wake. But Shaq knew he couldn't sustain this pace indefinitely. His eyes scanned his surroundings, searching for an advantage. Then he spotted it. A narrow dirt trail branching off from the main road, winding into a dense thicket of bushes and trees. "All right, you want to chase," Shaq muttered under his breath, slamming the accelerator and veering sharply onto the dirt path. The SUV's tires crunched against the gravel and dirt, its engine growling as it powered through the rough terrain. The bikers followed, but their sleek motorcycles, built for speed and agility on paved roads, struggled on the uneven ground. Duke realized Shaq's strategy and gritted his teeth, pushing his Harley to its limits. He closed the gap, determination evident in his eyes, but Shaq was one step ahead. The narrow path dipped into a shadowy valley, where the uneven terrain widened the gap between him and his pursuers. With every bump and twist, the sound of the motorcycles began to fade into the night. But Shaq didn't let up. He knew Duke wouldn't back down easily. For now, though, he had escaped their grasp, just enough time to prepare for the next move. The road ahead remained long and dark, but Shaq, with his calm resolve and sharp mind, had proven that even when cornered, he could turn the tables. The chase was far from over. It was only beginning. The roar of the bikers' engines had faded into the darkness, but Shaq remained tense, gripping the steel steering wheel tightly, his eyes locked on the road ahead. After a grueling chase across rugged terrain, a faint glow appeared in the distance, a small diner standing solitary in the vast Texas wilderness. A flickering neon sign read Maggie's Diner, like a beacon calling out to wanderers on this desolate road. Shaq pulled into the gravel parking lot and stopped in front of the diner. He sat in the car for a few seconds, letting his breathing steady before stepping out. Towering over 6'7", with a broad, muscular build, he immediately drew the attention of everyone inside the diner through its large glass windows. The diner's door creaked open, and the soft chime of a bell announced his arrival. Inside, warm yellow light bathed the space, which was old but impeccably clean. A few truckers sat at the counter, sipping black coffee, while an elderly couple enjoyed their dinner in a far corner. Heads turned toward Shaq as he entered, curiosity lighting their faces. Breaking the silence was Hank Big Rig Johnson, a seasoned trucker with a silver beard and sharp eyes. He removed his trucker cap and set it on the counter. "Well now, you don't see a man big enough to touch the ceiling walk in here every day," he said. Shaq nodded politely, offering a faint smile, though his gaze remained guarded, just stopping for a break. He replied in a deep, measured voice. Maddie, the middle-aged waitress with her hair pinned up, approached with a small notepad in hand. "Coffee?" she asked, her tone friendly but her eyes wary as she took in the dirt-streaked jacket Shaq wore. "Coffee, thanks," Shaq answered. He chose a seat near the counter, his back to the window, but his eyes scanned the room. He could feel the weight of curiosity from the other patrons, though no one pried. They simply stole glances before resuming their conversations. Maggie brought over his coffee and set it down. "Long way from home?" she asked. "Far enough to feel it," Shaq replied, his eyes flickering toward the door. His brief answer silenced any further questions. Maggie nodded and walked away. Shaq had just raised the coffee to his lips when the familiar rumble of motorcycle engines shattered the diner's peaceful atmosphere. The growl of the engines grew louder, feral, and menacing, like a pack of wild beasts descending. The truckers paused their conversations, their expressions hardening as they glanced toward the windows. The diner's door swung open again, and this time the bell clanged sharply, almost like a warning. Duke strode in, followed by a handful of his biker crew. The neon light from outside reflected off his worn leather jacket, highlighting the tattoos of skulls and crossed bones on his arms. A smug grin spread across Duke's face, but his eyes carried a simmering menace. Well, Duke drawled, savoring each word. "Didn't expect to see you here, giant." Shaq calmly set his coffee down, his muscles tightening as he braced himself for what was coming. "Just taking a break." "What about you?" "Still not tired." Duke smirked, his voice mocking. "Oh, don't get tired. Not when there's unfinished business." He glanced at his crew, giving them a subtle nod. A few bikers approached the counter, their eyes sweeping over the truckers as if daring them to react. Hank, the elder trucker, placed his coffee down and stood up. He didn't say a word at first, but his steely gaze locked onto Duke with unwavering calm. One by one, the other truckers rose from their seats, their rough hands and weathered faces silently forming a barrier between the bikers and Shaq. "No one causes trouble here," Hank finally said, his voice low but resolute. "If you've got business, take it outside." Duke arched an eyebrow, surveying the men standing before him. A thin smile curled his lips, but Shaq caught a flash of anger in his eyes. Duke wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in a space he typically dominated. "Relax," Duke said, waving dismissively and stepping back slightly. "I'm not here to trash Maggie's place." He turned his gaze to Shaq, his grin widening. "But I'll be waiting outside. We're not done yet." Shaq watched as Duke and his crew stepped out of the diner. The roar of engines erupted once more, this time signaling anticipation rather than departure. Shaq knew Duke wasn't one to let things slide, and the real confrontation was inevitable. Taking a deep breath, Shaq drained the last of his coffee, straightened his jacket, and prepared for what lay ahead. The quiet reprieve of the diner was over, and the next chapter of this battle was waiting just beyond the door. The roar of motorcycle engines outside growled like a menacing reminder seeping through the diner's door. Shaq sat still in his seat, his eyes fixed on the door. The simmering anger in his chest wasn't only due to the threat. It was because he knew all too well that Duke wouldn't back off easily. The sound of his engine still rumbling outside signaled one thing: this wasn't over. Hank Big Rig Johnson, an older trucker, walked slowly over to Shaq, his baseball cap clutched in his hand. His stance was upright, his broad shoulders resolute, as if he were no stranger to tough situations. "Listen, kid," Hank said, his voice gravelly. "You're big, and you look like you can handle yourself. But those guys out there aren't just your average thugs. They play dirty, and they'll be back with more of them. Shaq raised an eyebrow, locking eyes with Hank. I'm guessing you know a thing or two about them, he stated, not as a question, but as a certainty. Hank nodded, a heavy look crossing his face. I've been driving this route for years. Duke's crew isn't just racing bikes. They're do worse things: extortion, smuggling, threatening the locals. Nobody dares to stand up to them because everyone knows that once Duke has his sights on you, he doesn't stop. Shaq nodded silently. He already knew Duke was dangerous, but his brutality... He knew he wasn't just dealing with one man, but an entire dangerous network behind Duke. If Duke thought Shaquille O'Neal was the kind of man to fold under pressure, he had severely miscalculated. Outside, the night stretched on, its stillness masking the storm that was undoubtedly brewing. Shaq could feel it. The battle wasn't over, but he was ready. Shaq left Maggie's diner into the silence of a Texas night. His SUV glided smoothly away, leaving behind the faint neon lights and the motionless gravel lot. The moon hung low in the sky, casting pale silver over the surrounding hills and scattered brush. On the endless straight road, only the sound of tires grinding against the asphalt disturbed the oppressive stillness. Shaq leaned back in the driver's seat, his hands steady on the wheel. Although the road stretched empty with no sign of the motorcycles, unease clung to him like a second skin. Every small noise, the chirp of insects, the whisper of wind through the brush, set his nerves on edge. The confrontation at the diner was over, but he knew Duke wouldn't let it go. Duke's cold, menacing words echoed in his mind. Next time, there will be no one to protect you. Shaq glanced at the rearview mirror. The road was deserted, swallowed by darkness. Yet deep down he knew this calm wasn't safety. It was the stillness before the storm. Time passed, and the night grew heavier. Dark shadows from the hills and trees on either side of the road twisted into strange, ghostly shapes, as if silently watching. Shaq kept his breathing steady, but his body remained tense, ready for anything. Then it happened. A light appeared in the rearview mirror, small at first, a faint glow on the horizon, but it quickly multiplied into several bright headlights piercing through the night. The roar of motorcycle engines shattered the fragile quiet. Shaq gripped the wheel tighter, his eyes locked on the mirror. He didn't need to guess who it was. Duke's gang was back. The motorcycles closed in, their headlights flickering like predators circling their prey. The engine's growls grew louder, merging into a menacing symphony. Shaq took a deep breath, trying to keep his mind sharp. Stopping wasn't an option, and getting surrounded again would be a death sentence. This time, he needed a plan to turn the tables. The bikers drew closer, their headlights flooding Shaq's SUV with glaring light. One rider pulled alongside him, riding dangerously close. He pounded on the window with a gloved fist, the sharp sound like a challenge. "Run all you want, big guy. Let's see how you get out of this one," he shouted, his voice cutting through the rumble of engines. Shaq didn't reply, but inside he was calculating. His eyes darted to the terrain around him, low grassy hills and scattered shrubs, lining both sides of the road. Up ahead, the highway split into a crossroads, with one narrower path leading into a densely wooded area. A plan began to form in Shaq's mind as the bikers tightened their formation around him. He floored the gas, and the SUV surged forward, gaining a brief gap between him and the motorcycles. Duke, leading the pack on his Harley, didn't flinch. He shouted orders to his crew, urging them to speed up. Shaq could feel Duke's resolve. This time, he wasn't just chasing. He was determined to finish it. As Shaq neared the crossroads, his eyes flicked between the road ahead and the mirror. Approaching the turn, he suddenly braked hard and yanked the wheel to the left, sending the SUV careening onto a narrow dirt path. The engine roared as the tires dug into the loose gravel. Shaq knew the uneven terrain would slow the bikers and force them to adapt. The gang wasn't far behind. The motorcycles followed, but the rugged ground quickly threw them off balance. One rider, moving too fast, lost control, skidding out and crashing into the brush. "Watch it." Duke's voice boomed through the chaos, but his warning didn't stop the growing disorder among his crew. Shaq glanced in the mirror again, catching Duke's figure, relentless, his headlights blazing like the eyes of a predator. Shaq maintained his speed, navigating the uneven path with the precision of someone who had fought through countless battles. But he knew running alone wouldn't be enough. Duke wasn't just chasing him. He was out to dominate and crush him completely. In the oppressive darkness of the dirt trail, Shaq braced himself for the inevitable. He tightened his grip on the wheel, his eyes gleaming with determination as Duke's lights loomed larger in his mirror. What Duke didn't realize was that his prey wasn't just running. It was preparing to strike back. The roar of engines echoed through the night, but this time, something was different. The biker gang wasn't just chasing Shaq anymore. They were reorganizing their formation. Shaq noticed their headlights were no longer chaotic. They spread out into an arc, attempting to encircle the SUV from all sides. This was no longer a spontaneous pursuit. Duke had planned this, wanting to control the game. Shaq kept his focus, his large hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He recognized the shift in their tactics. These weren't just random thugs anymore. They were operating like a well-coordinated unit. Duke, the leader, remained in the center, signaling with sharp hand gestures, and the other bikers followed his commands like a pack of wolves closing in on their prey. A young biker with silver hair approached from the right, weaving dangerously close to the SUV. He leaned out, slamming his fist against the car door, the metallic clang piercing the night. "You're done running, big guy," he shouted, his voice full of taunting arrogance. On the left, another biker wearing a leather jacket studded with sharp spikes rode up alongside and swung a chain, smashing it against the car door with a deafening crash. Shaq glanced at the rearview mirror and saw two more motorcycles closing in from behind, their headlights glowing like the predatory eyes of a beast. Duke accelerated, surging ahead of the pack. He turned his head to throw Shaq a cold, challenging look, his eyes gleaming with malice. He raised a hand sharply, signaling two bikers from the rear to speed up, overtaking Shaq and forming a blockade in front of the SUV. They boxed him in, the space around the vehicle shrinking rapidly. Shaq took a deep breath, his muscles tensing beneath his jacket. He knew he had to act fast. The road ahead wound through low hills with a sharp curve only a few hundred meters away. He quickly assessed the terrain, a steep rocky drop on one side and dense, unruly bushes on the other. An idea sparked in his mind. "All right," Shaq muttered, his eyes sharp as knives fixed on the road ahead. He floored the gas pedal, the SUV surging forward with a powerful roar. The sudden burst of speed caught the bikers off guard. One rider ahead swerved his bike to avoid getting hit, creating a small gap. Shaq seized the moment, yanking the wheel to the left. The SUV tilted precariously, barreling into the curve at a dangerously high speed. The bikers chased closely behind, but the winding terrain began to test their limits. A tattooed biker on Shaq's tail pushed harder to catch up, but as he approached the curve, his tires slid on loose gravel. The bike lost its grip, sending the rider skidding off the road and crashing into the bushes. His panicked scream echoed, mixing with the screech of engines. Duke glanced back, his face darkening with rage. "Watch it," he shouted, his voice strained with anger, but his frustration was overpowering his patience. It accelerated, cutting past the other bikers, chasing the SUV relentlessly. Shaq remained calm, though his heart was pounding. He knew taking out one biker would only delay them briefly. Duke was still in the chase, and with his relentless determination, this fight was far from over. In the rearview mirror, Shaq saw the remaining bikers struggling to regroup, the uneven terrain throwing them off balance. Another biker wielding an iron rod sped toward the back of the SUV, ramming into it. The impact barely shook the vehicle. Shaq quickly swerved to the right, causing the biker to lose control and brake hard to avoid sliding off the road. Duke kept close. He wasn't like the others. The wild gleam in his eyes wasn't just about bruised pride. This was a hunt, and Shaq was the prey he refused to let escape. Up ahead, the road began to open, leading to a steep incline bordered by thick wild bushes. Shaq gripped the wheel tighter, his eyes reflecting sheer determination. If Duke thought he could corner Shaquille O'Neal, he was about to learn he had made the biggest mistake of his life. The real fight was just beginning. Shaq sped up through the final slope, the SUV gliding over gravel as a thick cloud of dust swirled under its wheels. But as the road widened, he realized he'd been cornered into a remote area. Before him stretched a vast open plain, encircled by high mounds of earth and dense thickets of shrubs. The road ahead appeared to dead end. Slamming on the brakes, Shaq brought the SUV to a screeching halt. A quick glance in the rearview mirror confirmed what he expected. Duke's biker gang was closing in fast. The headlights from their roaring motorcycles flooded the vehicle's interior with harsh light. They weren't chasing anymore. They were rounding him, forming a tight circle. The engines growled like thunder, blending with mocking laughter and threats shouted from every direction. Duke brought his Harley-Davidson to a stop in the middle of the clearing, directly in front of Shaq's SUV. Turning off the engine, he dismounted slowly, every step oozing arrogance. He wasn't in a hurry. He wanted to savor this moment of confrontation. "Well, looks like you've run out of road, big guy," Duke said, his voice dripping with menace. Each word stoked the fire. I got to hand it to you. You're tougher than I thought. But now, there's no one left to bail you out. Shaq pushed open the SUV door and stepped out, his massive frame looming in the glare of the motorcycle headlights, casting a long shadow across the ground. Standing tall, his calm yet piercing gaze betrayed no hint of fear. I don't need anyone's help, he said, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. If you want to settle this, then let's get it over with. Duke let out a low, sardonic laugh, his eyes gleaming with danger. I'll handle you myself, he barked, glancing back at his gang. Stay put and watch me teach this giant a lesson. With heavy steps, Duke moved forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. Shaq advanced too, his unyielding gaze locked on his opponent. They stopped a few feet apart, the tension between them palpable, as if the very air was being crushed. Without warning, Duke lunged forward, his fist clenched and aiming for Shaq's face. But Shaq was ready. He tilted his head, narrowly dodging the punch and countered with a sharp chop to Duke's arm. The biker staggered back a step but showed no sign of retreat. Not bad, Duke snarled, launching a low kick aimed at Shaq's legs. But Shaq was quicker. He caught Duke's leg midair, pivoted, and slammed him into the ground with bone-jarring force. The clearing seemed to quake under the impact of Duke's heavy frame hitting the dirt. The bikers around them fell silent, their eyes wide with shock and apprehension. Duke was no easy opponent, yet Shaq had just proven he was no ordinary rival. Duke scrambled to his feet, his eyes blazing with fury. The smugness was gone now. He was a man fighting to reclaim his pride. Reaching to his belt, he drew a gleaming dagger, the blade catching the glare of the headlights. Let's make this interesting, big guy, Duke growled, his tone low and menacing. Shaq didn't flinch. He stepped back, keeping a calculated distance, his sharp eyes locked on the weapon. His wrestling days had taught him more than brute force. They'd trained him to read every subtle movement of an opponent. Duke held the knife with practiced ease. This wasn't his first time using one. Duke lunged again, the blades slicing through the air with startling speed. Shaq pivoted, dodging the initial strike, but Duke was relentless. Twisting his wrist, Duke sent another thrust aimed at Shaq's midsection. This time, Shaq didn't evade. He seized Duke's wrist with an iron grip, squeezing hard enough to elicit a cry of pain. The knife dropped from Duke's hand, embedding itself into the ground. Seizing the moment, Shaq shoved Duke backward with his shoulder, sending him sprawling. Before Duke could fully recover, Shaq closed the distance, delivering a devastating punch square to Duke's jaw. The impact sent him crashing to the ground, where he lay motionless, dazed and defeated. The clearing fell silent, the bikers staring, their faces etched with disbelief and unease. Shaq stood tall, his chest heaving, but his eyes remained sharp and vigilant. Bending down, he picked up the fallen knife and hurled it far into the bushes. Duke lay there, breathing heavily, his face twisted in rage and humiliation. Don't think this is over, he hissed, venom lacing his words. Shaq leaned down, his towering presence casting an imposing shadow over Duke. It's best for you if it ends here, he said, because next time I won't let you walk away this easily. Duke said nothing, his teeth clenched as he spat blood onto the ground. With a sharp gesture, he signaled to his gang. One by one, the bikers shut off their engines and began to retreat. Duke was the last to leave, his glare fixed on Shaq, silently vowing revenge. As the sound of engines faded into the night, Shaq stood in the clearing, the tension slowly ebbing away. This battle was over, but he knew the storm wasn't gone. Duke would be back, and when he returned, Shaquille O'Neal would be ready. Shaq stood silently in the empty lot, the headlights of his SUV still blazing, illuminating the scene where Duke and his biker gang had just departed. The roar of the motorcycles faded into the night, but Duke's chilling warning echoed in his mind. This isn't over. Shaq took a deep breath, letting the cold night air fill his lungs in an attempt to dispel the tension. Yet he knew all too well that Duke's retreat was only temporary. The fiery determination in Duke's eyes as he left wasn't the look of someone willing to accept defeat. Stepping back toward his SUV, Shaq could feel the aches in his body from the fight, his muscles tense from the impacts, his fists still tingling from the final blow. But he had no regrets. This wasn't just a physical confrontation. It was a test of will, and Shaq had passed with his honor intact. He opened the driver's door and sank into the seat, but he didn't start the engine right away. Instead, he surveyed the lot, now eerily quiet. Tire tracks, footprints, and even the knife Duke had dropped remained etched into the dirt. The emptiness of the space seemed heavy, as if it bore silent witness to the intensity of what had just occurred. His gaze drifted to the rearview mirror, where his own reflection stared back at him. His face glistening with sweat, his sharp eyes calm yet resolute. He knew this victory wasn't just about physical strength or fighting skills. It was about steadfastness and strategy. Duke and men like him relied on aggression and intimidation to dominate others, but Shaq had shown he couldn't be overwhelmed by such tactics. A faint sound in the distance pulled Shaq from his thoughts. It wasn't the rumble of engines this time, but the soft crunch of approaching footsteps. He turned alert and saw Hank Big Rig Johnson emerge from the shadows. The older man, with his sharp eyes and sturdy presence, had been watching from afar throughout the fight. "You handled yourself well, Shaq," Hank said, his voice low and gravelly but full of admiration. He approached the SUV, glancing around the lot with a keen eye. Not many people would stand up to Duke and his crew, let alone take him down. Shaq allowed a faint smile to cross his face, though his exhaustion was evident. "He's not an easy guy to deal with, but I know his type. They think brute strength is everything." Hank nodded, folding his arms across his chest. "You're right about that, but don't let confidence make you careless. Duke's not the kind of man to let this go. You humiliated him in front of his gang. You bruised his pride. He'll be back, and next time he won't come alone." Shaq met Hank's gaze, sensing the sincerity in the older man's warning. "I know, but I'm not running. If he comes back, I'll be ready." Hank gave a small, approving smile, one that carried respect. "You've got the heart of a fighter, Shaq. But even the best fighters need allies. Remember, not all of us bow to Duke." Shaq felt the weight of Hank's words and nodded in quiet gratitude. "Thanks, Hank. I might need your advice sooner than I think." Hank placed a firm hand on Shaq's shoulder before turning to walk back into the darkness, where his massive truck awaited. Before disappearing, he called over his shoulder, "Take care out there, kid." The road ahead isn't just full of bikers. Shaq sat motionless in his SUV, reflecting on Hank's parting words. He started the engine, its growl breaking the heavy silence and reminding him that the journey wasn't over yet. The headlights cut through the dark, lighting up the long, uncertain road ahead. But Shaq wasn't afraid. He had faced Duke, and the worst the man had to offer, and he knew he'd only grow stronger as he continued. With a firm grip on the steering wheel and resolve in his eyes, Shaq drove into the night, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The dawn slowly rose over the Texas hills, its soft amber light spreading across the sky, dissipating the heavy darkness of the previous night. Shaq drove along the endless road, his eyes fixed straight ahead toward the horizon where the sun was beginning to rise. The morning light reflected off the windshield, bathing the car's interior in a warm golden hue, as if nature itself was welcoming a fresh start. The battle with Duke and his gang was over, at least for now, but Shaq knew his journey wasn't just about physical challenges. It was also about spirit, resilience, and a deeper understanding of his true strength. Strength wasn't just found in muscles or skills, but in the ability to hold on to faith when faced with adversity. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind, the angry faces of the biker gang, the hatred in Duke's eyes, and the unexpected camaraderie from Hank and the truckers. Shaq realized that in the most perilous moments, people didn't rely solely on their individual strength, but also on trust and support from those around them. A faint smile crossed his face as he thought of Hank. The older truck driver had shown him that no matter how harsh the road of life might be, there were always people willing to stand for what's right. They didn't have to be heroes wearing capes, just individuals who held on to their courage when it mattered most. The road ahead stretched endlessly, but Shaq no longer felt alone. He had found strength in solitude, but he also understood that true power came from a blend of personal resolve and trust in the community. The sunrise felt like a symbol of renewed hope, reminding him that each day offered a chance to confront and overcome any challenge. As the SUV sped across a small bridge, Shaq glanced down at the shimmering water below. The tiny ripples sparkled under the sunlight, a reminder that even when things seemed still, strength always resided beneath the surface. A strange sense of relief washed over him, not because the challenges were behind him, but because he knew he was ready for whatever lay ahead. The horizon opened up with lush green fields stretching on either side of the road. A gentle breeze teased through the slightly open window, carrying the earthy scent of Texas. Shaq gripped the steering wheel firmly, his gaze resolute, free of hesitation or worry. Each mile was a reminder that this journey wasn't just about finding peace, but also about discovering and asserting himself. He knew Duke wouldn't give up. There would be more confrontations, more trials. But Shaq was no longer the same. He wasn't just a giant with physical strength. He was a warrior with an unshakable spirit, ready to stand not only for himself but also for the values he believed in. As the sun climbed higher, its rays illuminating the sky with brilliance, Shaq pressed the gas pedal, accelerating forward. The SUV roared down the road, leaving behind the ghosts of the previous night and heading toward an open future in the radiant light of the new day. Shaquille O'Neal, a fighter both on and off the court, continued his journey. He wasn't just traversing the roads of Texas, he was uncovering the true power within himself. On these vast roads, Shaq wasn't just moving forward. He was reaching further, armed with unwavering determination, steadfast spirit, and an indomitable will. And so unfolds the dramatic journey of Shaquille O'Neal on the sprawling Texas highways, where he not only faced unexpected dangers but also discovered the strength that lay within. Will Duke relent, or will another confrontation await in the future? What do you think Shaq needs to do to prepare for the challenges ahead?